something that I've worked on all my life, though I must say that when I introduce myself, I often say, though I don't let other people say that, I often say that I am a failed scientist, having written exclusively for the agricultural science community for almost 15 years of my life, and realizing that nobody in the agricultural sciences would read anything that I've written. So it's actually a few heterodox economics people, a few civil society organizations, farming communities, a few farmers who've read my work, and some scientists, some people who are doing basic science. So my readership has been entirely, well, let's say, misfired. So therefore, the failed scientist, well, heading. Now, what I want to say today, I thought I would say something very radical and would be very negative about science. And I was very worried when I came here because this is live streaming and whatnot. But I realized I'm perhaps going to be the only one defending science today. So may I just start by saying that I put Bernal and Polanyi here as and Polanyi, to say that this debate about Bernal versus Polanyi is something that is perhaps completely wrong, because both of them, both Bernal and Polanyi, wanted the sciences to, well, inform policy and work with the state, but using the principles of science. They both agreed that it had to be the principles of science that would actually. I'm going to see the screen. Is this? Seems to bring up the screen here.
That's okay. You just keep it going.
Okay. So I wanted to begin by emphasizing this, that when we say knowledge and institutions, and we say knowledge has to have has a social contract, and that the autonomy of knowledge has to be well, let's say, emphasized over time. Different organizations and the ways in which we design ourselves. We often miss this point that when science becomes, let's say, enslaved to certain institutions, we actually lose both the social contract and the content of science. So in some of the work that we've done, we've actually argued that the biggest impact of the Green Revolution, which perhaps did feed the country, and well, we know that there have been successes in production at least till the 1980s. The first phase of the Green Revolution, as Palasa would put it, till the mid-1980s, did actually have a revolutionary increase in production and productivity, and did feed our people. Now, that first phase actually led to the biggest negative impact of the Great Revolution, which is a complete destruction, deprivation, and actually an increasing irresponsibility of the agricultural sciences. And this is something that I want to speak on, and want to emphasize the fact that it is the institutionalization of science. Oops, what's his name? Sorry. Okay. Sorry. It's coming on. Yeah. For me, before I begin this, or before I get to this slide, I just want to ask specifically about how many of us would see institutions as rules, norms, and habits of thought, and how many of us would see institutions as organizations? Because right at the very first presentation, you heard Samins talk about institutions as organizations, and may I make this distinction very clear that I'm not talking about organizations. So when we talk about an institution, let's say like marriage or the statutes of a university, those are institutions, and the family or the university is the organization. So please, let's make that very clear. So when I say the institutionalization of science, I don't mean the existence of science within an organization, but the ways in which these, well, let's say the organizations of science are governed by the institutions, or let's say the norms in which science exists in our society, and the norms that govern its social contract in terms of development imperatives. Yeah. So let me begin with having made this point that it's often we misread Bernal and Polanyi as Bernal versus Polanyi, but it's actually a debate about Bernal and Polanyi both demanding the increasing scientization of development. And unfortunately, what the scientization of development has done has not been, well, let's say, in many ways a positive impact for science, but has been a usage or a utilitarian content of science. That is,
that science becomes one of the tools that certain actors in development, or let's say leading thinkers of development, have tended to use science as an input into their visions of development. In some cases, of course, in most cases, science has contributed to it too. So may I begin with one of the biggest crises that we're facing now in terms of food, agriculture, and nutrition in this country in particular, but globally too. I mean, let's look at the global hunger, or let's say global deprivation within farming communities. We had a very, very visionary statement, and I picked this for a very specific reason. A quote from Professor V.K.R.V. Rao, was one of the founders of many, economics, social science research labs, basically economics. Again, somebody who's also evolved, somebody who actually founded an institute called Institute of Economic Growth, and ended up founding after many others, ended up founding an institute called Institute for Social and Economic Change. So here's somebody who's actually evolved in his understanding of what knowledge could do, and what knowledge was needed in this country. So this quotation from one of his works in 1982 is something that asks for a policy for food, agriculture, and nutrition, which I've kind of given an acronym as FAN, as India's Food, Agriculture, and Nutrition Policy, which is quite contrary to what we see as India's food policy, agricultural policy, or its nutrition policy. What he wants is, well, if you apply a Burkean pentadec of act, actor, or agency, purpose, context, and basically the ways in which the demand is made, you see that the demand is not for producing, well, X number of tons of food grain or maximizing food grain production. The demand is not for so many numbers of people to be given so many kilocalories of food. The demand is for, or let's say the policy is for minimizing nutritional inequalities among people, and the agency that he has is basically a policy, or let's say the context is one of decentralized action, taking full account of local resources, availabilities, cost preferences, and traditions. And again, the agency is, of course, that of knowledge, but again, knowledge of both agriculture, food, and all three: agriculture, food, and nutrition. Why is this quotation important? Because it deploys a completely different, well, let's say, institutional mechanism, that is, the rules, norms, ways of working that this demand, that this policy demands, is something that's completely different from what we've institutionalized and the content of science we have in alternative institutions that we've created. So institutions, we know, have always evolved with knowledge. So if we look at the ways in which institutions, as in rules, norms, and habits of thought that have evolved over time, and the content of knowledge in the agricultural systems that have evolved over time, we find that as we started as let's say hunter-gatherers, people who've been accessing food through various let's say endosomatic sources, that is within our bodies as a species, how we accessed food. We've seen how systems evolve from the biophysical realities, the rules and norms that governed these societies, to settled agriculture, and also a settled agriculture which was led by very different kinds of people, women, different kinds of organizational systems, different rules and norms for collecting and storing food. Again, how wheat domesticated us. I mean, this is again something new kind of literature that's emerging about how wheat and some domestic animals domesticated us, and not that we domesticated them. That is, the ways in which our rules and norms evolved in response to certain biophysical realities. Now, knowledge has been, well, let's say, growing through all this, and has been, well, let's say, has had a very concrete and substantive linkage between the hand and the head through all these systems, through all these evolutions that you've seen in agriculture. But as the agricultural sciences, or the sciences, become, well, let's say, institutionalized, organized for production, and again organized for a very concentrated structures of production knowledge, or let's say knowledge for production, agricultural production,
what happens is that there's a changing rationality that comes in, starting with questions of how do you reduce drudgery, to questions of how do you understand soils, how do you put in more resources or more manure or how do you reclaim certain soils, whether it is guano or the English agricultural revolution. There is an evolution of the nature of, again, what Soumya was talking about, the kind of funding, for instance, whether it's Bosingol's experiments or Liebig's experiments or the first production of phosphates from Gilbert and Lawes. There is an institutionalization of the relationship between knowledge and agricultural production that is through certain patrons, maybe private patrons, maybe a set of lords or landlords enabling institutionalized or rich farmers. So there are these slogans that you hear in Europe and France and Germany, in England, where the institutionalization of agricultural science for production happens. Slogans like knowledge for knowledge for profit, knowledge for power. All these kinds of slogans come about. And public funding of agricultural science also starts, again, public funding of agricultural science starts in back home in Britain, many years after it starts in India. Of course, the colonial government found a desire to institutionalize public sector agricultural science in India much earlier, because of course they had an economic interest here. What happens in the 1940s and with the evolution of let's say, post-World War agriculture and post-World War industrial production is an increasing industrial appropriation and substitution of biological production. You find that almost 80% to 90% of the chemical energy that goes into agriculture gets appropriated by industry, and states, as in elected democratic governments, enable or fund knowledge generation for this. That becomes, well, let's say, what they call development. That is, development is the increasing industrial appropriation and substitution of biological production. And as this progresses, I mean, from the 1950s, maybe 1960s, with the revolution and the onset of a whole range of inputs that come in from the US, the Technology Cooperation Mission, and the USAID, a whole range of other, mechanisms that come, including some fertilizer, industry that came in with 100% FDI. It's not that FDI is anything new to this country. We've had FDI and those kinds of inputs throughout our history. Now, what happens is this institutionalization of science within this development agenda, within the acknowledged and accepted within economic theory, within mainstream development economics, as an input for development and industrial appropriation and substitution of biological production becomes institutionalized in planned development. What you see is an increasing, impact on agriculture, or let's say what I've called agriculture and the development burden that increases over time. And what happens to science as a consequence is that science becomes enslaved to a development agenda. And it's very sad when you see science of this sort. And in many forums that I've spoken, and when scientists have questioned this, I've had to point out with examples within the content of soil science, within the content of genetics, within the content of soil physics, I mean, in particular. There are cases where you can actually illustrate where the agenda that has been with the sciences to do certain kinds of science is given up to cater to a productivity argument or to something that will allegedly lead to a particular development output, because those the ways in which it has been institutionalized. Not because the content of science is actually telling you, or the context is telling you that you should work on this. So science under siege is something again that I've used in some work that I've done earlier. So if we look at science under siege, I mean the best example is the 1980s. Let's look at some of the modern debates now and go back to the 1980s and say, did we have the evidence then? I mean, about the rapid and persistent decline of incremental output to unit use of fertilizer. Did we have it in the 1980s? Yes, we did. This is fertilizer use efficiency from the Fertilizer Association of India, from the producers and defenders of chemical fertilizers. These are people who desperately want fertilizer use efficiencies to increase. They desperately want people to buy more fertilizers. They do want India to use more chemical fertilizers. And still, this is the evidence that they give. Yeah? So it's not that evidence was lacking. So what did we do? What did our scientists do to improve fertilizer use efficiency? There were a few experiments. There still are a few experiments. Unfortunately, they are all institutionalized within a particular paradigm of science, within a particular way of organizing, or within certain institutions of science. That is, what is expected of science, what is done as the content of science is dictated by certain rules and norms which have nothing actually to do with the content of science, but have been, well, dictated to us by a particular development paradigm. Development as in, well, the demonstration effect of industrialized countries, the monocultures there, the ways in which they have produced and they have allowed the industrial appropriation of production systems. Raghu spoke about well, China moving increasingly to high-tech sectors and well, you know, what will their low-skilled workers, cheap labor do? I mean, yes, China will face a crisis now. China is probably realizing that it's facing an increasing crisis with production returning home to, well, clean production returning. They've, of course, the West has exported a lot of polluting industries to the third world. We've received many of them, happily. We're still asking for more. But we know that well, once robotics, that's perhaps what is the interest, that is perhaps the key driver that Japan wants more labor for from India. But anyway, so China will face an increasing crisis as the world shifts to robotics and clean production goes back to the industrialized countries, because their biological production systems will suffer just like ours is now, because there is going to be an increasing inability to cater to the industrial demands or industrial output demands of the developed world. Why is this important to us as biological production systems? What does this evidence tell us about where we should be heading in terms of the content of science? I mean, in terms of the content of science, well, in some sense, autonomous or independent of what Bernal calls the social contract of science, that is, science catering to development as development imagined by certain actors who've been given to certain, well, demonstration effects or a desperate desire to become as, well, climb the ladder like like developed countries have. So we need a different development imagination, and that's possible. Some of us have been, well, let's say, doing work with various groups. I've listed a few of these here. India's Questions on India's Soils, IIT Delhi, Srinagar University, and the Revitalization of Rainfed Agriculture Network. There's a global 40,000 initiative that's been launched from France, and that's a really interesting initiative where each one of us can individually do something to enrich soil carbon. FAO 2015, International Year of Soils. Some of these slides were presented there too. So the question of what evidence has done to rethinking science, or, well, let's say, reinvesting in science and the content of science, and reimagining development, says that there's very little that evidence has contributed. There's very little maneuverable room that science has had. Today, the biggest evidence that we have, 2017, well, India's Hunger and Malnutrition Index. Let's recall Amartya Sen's famous statement that hunger and malnutrition are a moral outrage given despite the productive capacities that we have now. The biggest question is it because of, or despite the productive capacities, or is it because of productive capacities? Is it because science has failed to deliver the right kind of production capacities that are needed, the right kind of responsible innovation that is needed, or is it because science has just paid lip service to, well, a certain development agenda that's been given to us? I've been telling my students that, you know, you guys are going to face a major problem when you recruit people, because 38% of what you recruit will be stunted material. Sorry, it's very, very painful, but we have to realize that my students now, who are in their 20s now, will be recruiting, well, from a really bad pool, sad pool. How did we get there? There is a big corpus of international literature, international, Indian, third world, global south, call it whatever you will, on how we got there, the relationship between agricultural science, technology, and development. I'm just going to skip this because this is actually something that's from a couple of things that we've written and also worked on as part of an international assessment of agricultural science technology for development. Basically arguing that we've been through all these critiques, and every step, what you see as from the 90s chronologically, is actually just one step in the technology treadmill. We're not stepping out of the institutionalization of development and institutionalization of science within that development paradigm, within a particular kind of agriculture, a Rostovian model of sequential growth. To continue this, this is the way we are now. We're facing a whole range of, well, alternatives that have come. Some have come in with studies of ecology, good governance, social protection, and so on. But here, in all these, what you see is that science is doing just the same thing. It's investing in increasing production and productivity, even when there are second-generation problems, which is what agricultural science has always told us. They invest in solutions that are just part of the same paradigm. And the content of science, again, if we have time, we'll talk about that. So there are alternatives that actually ask or enable people to look outside the box. Works like here in India, Professor Amulya Reddy, Georges Kirojan, I mean, there are many people who spoke about, well, actually not just about the kind of energy and production relations, but also about the nature of science that goes into these. That is, it's not just about rural industrialization, Amulya Reddy wanted appropriate technology and so on, but he was also asking us about the nature of science, the nature of knowledge that goes into these production systems. And when you institutionalize science in a particular way, science has no other alternative but to do just what is demanded of or let's say what those organizations are designed for. What are the rules and norms that dictate, well, the structures of the organizations and the role of science within that. So this is just an illustration from what are the alternatives to a life science-based production systems approach or a knowledge-based bioeconomics approach. That there are alternatives, and there are alternatives that are living right now. I mean, whether it's a Timbuktu Collective or the Via Campesina or any of these alternatives, there are many, many alternatives in agriculture. The Sun Commune in China, there are many examples that are actually showing us how the problem statements, the resource constraints, the kind of knowledge, and all these have a different institutional makeup, that is rules, norms that govern their existence and the ways in which they relate to markets as consumers. Yeah. So if we actually want the sciences to cater to food, agriculture and nutrition in a linked way, that is minimizing nutritional inequalities as what Professor Rao had demanded, we need a different kind of science, obviously. We need a context that is a contextual understanding of the prevalent agri-food regimes and their values. Why are they different? This is again Harriet Friedman's, Michael Phillips, and their kind of work, which argues that the kind of agri-food regimes we have now with their vertical value chains and their decomposable units of commodities don't allow us to even have a right kind of problem statement about the energy flows. Agriculture today, allegedly primary producer. What is a primary producer? A primary producer is something that harvests the abundant energies that the sun gives us, or resources, and it produces additional energy, right? Agriculture today is a net energy guzzler and is not a net energy producer, which it was for millennia since human beings started, well, cultivating or using biological production systems. So we need a different kind of problem statement. We get away from this institutionalization of life science-based value chains of decomposable units and move towards knowledge-based bioeconomies of value networks, some of which Raghu was speaking about, value networks where employment, that is, we're not looking at 9 billion mouths to feed, which is a rhetoric that we've been fed endlessly. We're looking at 18 billion hands to work. There are opportunities there. We have to create value networks and again lateral systems of engaging with knowledge, not just scientific knowledge. So we need a science that shifts from speaking truth to power, that is speaking to these development thinkers and policy makers and so on. Some of them are of course scientists themselves who's, well, moving upward mobility is actually getting into positions of power and becoming bureaucrats themselves. So science speaking to power, move to a position of making sense together. Get to work with other knowledge systems, get to work with other actors, acknowledge the inequalities that exist in our society, acknowledge that we can actually make a difference as scientists, instead of, well, serving under, a development regime that has put us under siege. So we need to, this is again coming from an economist who's devoted his entire life, over 45 years of relentless publications, Vernon Rutten, supporting the Green Revolution, supporting everything that this irrigation, chemical intensive biological production system has done. So he's written endlessly about that. In a speech that he gave in 2005 to the American Philosophical Transactions, Society for Philosophical Transactions, He spoke about how we need a science, an agricultural science that would move away from this life science-based system and would actually focus on a set of institutional innovations in learning that can actually revamp the science to building secure bridges between the island empires of agriculture, health, and environment, and he illustrates a few of these. So we actually need a science that can actually challenge the current limits of the coevolution and complexity of knowledge. Norbert's work, which talks about how industrial societies are unable to respond to the 4 or 5 different systems that are co-evolving with us. Climate change is the biggest example of this. But the loss of biodiversity, or let's say the other 7 planetary limits that we have transcended already, are proof of our inability to respond in a co-evolutionary fashion to the other systems. We are responding only to price signals. We are responding only to signals of scarcity within a minor component of our economy. And sciences have a much greater moral role than to respond to these minuscule concerns about, even questions of funding for science. People have done good science with absolutely no funding. That kind of science has disappeared. I agree with Arvind. That kind of science has disappeared. We need a different, but there is a different set of knowledge systems where science can engage meaningfully. And I sincerely hope that this dialogues and everything that we have on board today will encourage us to do that. Thank you.
Idea of, you have talked about why science should not be institutionalized, particularly agricultural science you talked about. Institutions and organizations you talked about. Organizations are different, whereas the moment you move into institutions, you are bound by rules and set of norms and so on and so forth. There are various facts and figures which can be analyzed in one way or the other. Agriculture is a very complicated subject. Perhaps there are not many agricultural scientists having spent 40 years in agriculture. We do understand a little bit. And I do understand that agriculture science should be dealt in perhaps in a different manner than any, say, physics or chemistry or mathematics. Because it is an amalgamation of all the science that you can think of, whether it is biology, whether it is chemistry, whether it is physics, any science you can think of, it is an amalgamation of that. But more importantly, that it has to be dealt so differently in terms of developmental plans, because we are talking about social contract of science, and nothing is more integrated than agriculture in that sense. And therefore perhaps I was only thinking that perhaps too simplistic analysis may actually be misleading, that whatever happened is, whatever adverse impacts we are seeing is because A, B, C. It's much more complicated than that. Because agriculture policy or agriculture science policies had always been totally disconnected, devoid of the country's overall developmental policies to start with. Whether you're talking about the land grabs, use of different modes of different sources of energies, or why the focus was in the 50s of managing the hunger, and now once we have managed hunger, we are able to think about managing nutrition, which is the right approach. But then, it's like this, Rajeswari, that we all know that every time we are using our cars and we are leaving so many carbon footprints, and yet all of us cannot go back to cycling all the time in our lives. It's not possible. So it is not possible. Similarly, in agriculture science, and more so in agriculture science, it is not as simple or black and white that you take this path or you take that path. So we have to think in totality, and unless there is an institutional mechanism, at least in whichever way, I fully agree with you that perhaps the way we went about it perhaps was not the right one. But unless you have some mechanism to provide you a plan or a roadmap which will give you a long-term sustainable agricultural mechanism, there won't be any. There won't be any, believe me. I mean, just going back to older systems of agriculture is not a solution. An early 1950s film, Do Bigha Zameen, many of you must have seen, and you have seen the plight of the farmer 60 years back. Haven't we moved forward? If we haven't, at least we have been able to provide food to 5 times more population. At some, there will always be, you'll have to pay back. Now is the time, because at that time, the plans were short-term. So I agree that we must have a long-term plan for sustainable agriculture. But unless there is any institution to provide that, any mechanism to prepare a plan, I think we will go nowhere. Thanks.
Thank you. I kind of agree with you, but I just have one. May I ask a question in return, ma'am? Can I?
Yeah, sure.
Is this sustainable agricultural production? Mm-hmm. No. Okay. Now then I have a couple of points to make about the inability of the agricultural sciences to actually respond to, well, the complexity that agriculture is about, yes, and the inability of the ways in which it is being institutionalized. I've never said in this presentation that we need to go back to, well, living in caves or cycling or anything. We might have to do that as systems change and as fuels become more expensive. But the point is that there are alternatives that are decentralized, short value chains, giving people jobs and higher value added in location-specific systems. You look at the Berkshires, the Bristol case, the cases in Karnataka, the cases in Andhra, where there are small value chains that are doing this very effectively. So in terms of knowledge also, we need to think of China has 17,000 municipal science commissioners. That is, the municipality has science commissioners who enable the linkage between, well, what Bhatnagar lamented in 1943, the linkage between actual industrial use of knowledge and, well, the knowledge that's created at the universities. So enabling these. So there are alternatives that are possible, and the agricultural sciences today are not engaging with either the complexity and are far, far away from the kind of integration that we need. And I have about 25 odd publications which talk about these things. I've not referred to any of these here, but the point is that if there's anything that this presentation is not, it is not simplistic. I was worried it was a bit too well, complex for that. So it's definitely not simplistic, and I definitely am not going to take this position that agriculture should not be institutionalized, and that's not what I was saying. That agriculture needs institutionalization of a very different sort, a knowledge-based bioeconomic paradigm, which the European Union is incidentally experimenting with. So we can think of that, and we can actually find alternatives to that.
Just one more word.
Sure.
Let's not just be following the European model or the Chinese model. Indian model has to be Indian.
Arvind, one quick one. Last one. Very quick. So this locus of change in thinking
Where do you think it will come from? Will it come from the community of agricultural scientists or performing farmers or from social scientists? What do you think will kind of crystallize this change in thinking about agricultural sciences or agricultural technologies, I would say?
Well, I mean, there are a few agricultural scientists, as in people who actually work with the sciences and actually engage with technologies that farmers use also. So there are some of them who are contributing to this question of change too. But the locus of change is coming largely from fortunately or unfortunately, from the Indian middle class, from farming communities who are actually enabling some changes. I mean, farmers who are refusing to use certain kinds of certain paradigms in production, whether it's a question of pests or chemicals, and they have seeking alternatives, and there is a change that's happening. And there are millions of cases of successes. There are websites that list many of these.
Thank you, Rajesh.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.